King for a limited time.
Live from Radio Cayman Studio, this is
Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community.
Money Sense is brought to you by the Chamber Pension Plan. For further information, visit chamberpension.ky.
They called it the crisis of 2020, an unspecified calamity that could, quote, rival the greatest trials our ancestors have known and serve as, quote, the next great hinge of history. It could be an environmental catastrophe, they wrote, a nuclear threat, or, quote, some catastrophic failure in the world economy. They predicted the crisis of 2020 in 1991. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Emil Kalinowski, and I am broadcasting to you live from Radio Cayman Studios on 89.9 in Grand Cayman and 93.9 in Cayman Brac and Little Cayman. In the studio with me is Adam Newman, a macroeconomist. Yes, a man on the edge. Yes, a man that is concerned. Certainly, someone that could do with some time off, of course, but we're not going to give it to him. Adam, when you are speaking, when you're at cocktail parties and people come up to you for advice and mentorship and they ask you, what is the most important book outside of the religious texts that you have ever read? What do you tell them?
Good morning, Emil. So, certainly the most influential book that I've read, which is forming my current views of the world, is The Fourth Turning, which is a book written back in 1997 by William Strauss and Neil Howe, two demographers. And this was actually a second book they'd written, a follow-up to their first book, which was, I think, called Demographics? Generations. Anyway, so this book is the most influential. 2020 has been certainly one of the strangest years I think we've all encountered, certainly one of the toughest years in living memory from a political point of view, from a social point of view, from an economic point of view. And I would argue the ramifications of all of what we're witnessing are only just beginning. We will, live with this for some time. But now we're on the cusp as well of probably one of the most important US elections, certainly in the last 100 years, which sort of binds all of this story together. And as you said, who could have predicted, what we're going through? And actually, it was predicted back in 1997 in this book. And it makes total sense. And so I thought it'd be great to change things up today and discuss this. So this Fourth Turning book it's all about how social moods are cyclical and they're driven essentially by generational aging. History, there's a well-coined phrase, which is, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. Throughout history have these periods, these cycles, which, become very predictable. And they're largely predictable because human behaviour hasn't really changed. Although we have evolved as a species, human behaviour hasn't really evolved in the last couple of millennia. So Neil Howe and William Strauss wrote this book and realised that history was repeating in these cycles, mini cycles and big cycles, throughout the last 500 years in US history. And actually, that's very similar to what we see in Western democracies. The pattern repeats.
It was Anglo-American history.
Exactly, yes.
For our audience.
Correct. And so what they realise actually is that we can split these sort of changes, these turning points, these turnings, as they referred to them, on roughly every generation, roughly every 20 years. And that cycle is bound by a bigger cycle, which is the saeculum, which is a repeating cycle every 80 to 100 years. This is effectively the natural length of a human lifetime. And the reason we have these big changes is because of the mood and the climate with which people were born into. And that affects both in their early childhood and when they're coming of age in their sort of middle age and they become in these more important roles. That, the world they inherit effectively guides and influences how they are as people and as a cohort. And we have gone through, Neil Howe and William Strauss like to define these as along seasonal lines. So we have a spring, obviously what follows spring, summer, autumn, and now we have a winter. And as we know, winter is a not a pleasant period, and so winter is a crisis period. And we are entering the crisis period. And as I say, this was all predicted back in 1997. And we're still in the relatively early phases of winter. This could last another 5 to 10 years. The important thing is to affect the change that we need, you have to go through a crisis. Otherwise, change doesn't happen. So this is going to be a difficult period. This is clearly what we're seeing now. But the good thing is that from winter, we get to spring, we get to eventually a new golden age. So just to sort of a little bit more background in that, the way Neil Howe and William Strauss defined these generations was there are effectively 4 archetypes. We have prophets, we have nomads, we have heroes and artists. Now, for our listeners, if you are a boomer generation, you were a prophet. The Gen X, which I just fall into, I think you're possibly the same. Emil.
That is correct. I'm very proud of that fact.
We're the nomads. We were brought up in a time where parenting was relatively laissez-faire. We kind of went and did our own things. There wasn't particularly heavy parenting regulation, etc. And that defines us. And
they didn't care too much about us. In fact, it was a generation that was allowed to do whatever they pleased, and that lack of love created a generation that was the most arrested, the highest rate of teen pregnancy, violent crime, drug use. It was but also a generation that could manage on its own, that found its own way, and didn't look to outside institutions for assistance. Just go on. Yes.
Yeah, no, correct. And actually what's really interesting is when you see that in culture and music. So I think about back to the most important films that I was when I was growing up, and they were things like Ferris Bueller's Day Off, The Goonies, the Lost Boys. These were all these films where there wasn't a parental character. There wasn't. It was a very sort of almost dark stuff. It was kids looking after themselves, and that defined, and the music, the indie music and stuff like that, that really defined that period.
And I'm sorry to interrupt you, but more from the cultural realm, a lot of the children were evil. That was when Rosemary's Baby came out. That was when The Exorcist came out. Children of the Corn. They don't make movies like that today. They make movies about sweet little baby, cute little kids, and how parents love them and how wonderful they are. But there was a different mood.
Different social mood, exactly.
The mood does not stay the same.
Exactly. And then so when we look to the current, the other generations, millennials and our children's generation, which is post that, which we don't yet have a name for, these children were much more protected. Are much more protected. Their songs, and as you said, the films reflect that. They're much cleaner, with superheroes and stuff.
They're much more risk averse.
Much more risk averse. So that kind of leads us to where we are now. And the millennials were trying to get a job, were coming of age when the 2008 crisis came about, and that's obviously shaping their influence now. But what's really interesting in this fourth turning, which we're now in, is this realization, or not realization. We've come to the inflection point where the institutions that were created previously by that the last hero generation, which was the GI generation who fought in World War II
and survived the Great Depression.
That
sounds familiar.
Those institutions that were created are no longer serving the good, the people today. We've changed, we've evolved, and therefore we need to find new institutions. But we know that it's, in good times, people don't. It's very hard to affect change. It's good. Everyone's happy. There's not the necessity. So now we have to go through a crisis period, which will be the catalyst for change. And it effectively is when we can galvanize finally a population around something that will lead to change. And now we've got probably 2 things really stick out in my mind that we can galvanize around. One is this global pandemic, and the other is climate change. These will probably become very pivotal in how we move forward and shape sort of future generations. As I said, we still need to go through a crisis period, but this period we're entering is one which ultimately, if history does rhyme, is one of sort of greater conformity, probably more authoritarian approach, more populist, more centrist, and that will then shape future generations.
That's absolutely right. And this is not the first time we've gone through this. That's one of the key points about this book. And at the beginning, I asked Adam, what's the most influential book, if anyone ever asked you for advice. And theoretically, if anyone ever asked me for that sort of like guidance and mentorship, I too would say the most important book I've ever read outside of the religious texts is The Fourth Turning. And Adam, we're not the only ones in our field in macroeconomics, although I think this is a broad book that applies broadly. Many, many people say that this book has shaped their worldview. It certainly shaped my worldview because I thought beforehand that time was linear and that things were getting worse and they would continue to get worse along the path we were on because it was linear. Let me just read a very quick quote. The fourth turning is history's great discontinuity. It ends one epoch and begins another. History is seasonal, and winter is coming. Like nature's winter, the secular winter can come early or late. The fourth turning can be long or difficult, brief or severe, mild. But like winter, it cannot be averted. It must come in its turn, meaning it's cyclical. We've been here before. And that gave me great confidence because I felt kinship with people of the past who have gone through similar crises. And as you mentioned, this book stretches back 500 years or so to 1400s of Anglo-American history in this sort of rhyming pattern. I don't know where I was going with that, but if you have anything, jump in. If not, I'm going to read another quote.
No, read the other quote.
See, ladies and gentlemen, William Strauss and Neil Howe, they made it a more, scientific, more historical. But we've seen this notion of cyclicality in human affairs come up in all manner of literary works. And of course, I was just referencing winter, and I've got a book here in front of me here, and let's see if anyone can guess what it is. The Others, Old Nan agreed. Thousands and thousands of years ago, a winter fell that was cold and hard and endless, beyond all memory of man. There came a night that lasted a generation. And that is, of course, from Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin, which was published the same year as The Fourth Turning. It's unbelievable, and there are lots of literary books that speak to this cyclicality. And it's also hopeful because on the other side is spring and hope. And we're coming up on our break, and after the break, I'm going to read another quote from a situation taking place 10,000 years into the future, just again to bring the idea of cyclicality. And then we're going to talk about how the present millennial generation may be affected about the crisis we're living through, how financially, how the boomers may be affected, and how Generation X may be affected. So ladies and gentlemen, please hold on and come right back.
The Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan. We're here for you. Did you know that between May and August 31st, in support of the COVID-19 Emergency Withdrawal Program, the Chamber Pension Plan leveraged IT and human resources to successfully review over 16,000 member applications, approve over 12,000 applications, and paid over CI $130 million to our plan members. We are the Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan, and we're here for you. For further information regarding the Emergency Withdrawal Program, visit chamberpension.ky. And for information as it happens, follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, or Instagram. Email admin@pensions.ky or call 745-7630.
Money Sense, the only personal finance radio show in the Cayman Islands, hosted by Simon Caudry from the CFA Society Cayman Islands.
This is Money Sense.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We are talking about a renaissance, about living through history with a capital H. And I exited the show reading from Game of Thrones, which takes place in several thousand years ago in a mysterious, forgotten, misted land and beyond time. And now we're going to skip forward 10,000 years into the future, and I'm going to read a passage from Foundation, a book by Isaac Asimov written in 1951. Here it is. Terminus, which is a planet, and its companion Foundation, also a planet, at the other end of the galaxy are the seeds of the Renaissance and the future founders of the Second Galactic Empire. And it is the present crisis that is starting Terminus off to this climax. Renaissance, crises, climaxes, resetting. This book takes place well into the future. And a lot of people will say, well, that makes sense, and it's because technology brings on this crisis. Adam, I'm just reading about a futuristic book, and you wanted to bring up something about technology and these cyclical crises.
Yeah, it's interesting actually. You know, whether the sort of chicken and egg, whether technology drives the change that we see, or whether technology is part of the change, whether it's not, whether it's a catalyst or facilitates change. And certainly William Howe and Neil Strauss would argue that it facilitates, but it's not the catalyst for change. And why is that? It's, if you look at something like a Facebook maybe 20 years ago, even if we had that technology available, which maybe great minds could have come up with, it just wasn't necessary. It wasn't something that the social, was a social need at the time.
Generation X did not want to be social.
Exactly.
Millennials do.
Exactly, 100%. So technology came along because of the social mood and prospered because of, in the same way we talk about culture and films and songs and stuff, it wasn't its time. And therefore, you know, had there been a Facebook 20 years previous to when it came out, it probably would have failed and, you know, flopped. So technology does facilitate change, but it's not the catalyst for change. But clearly, you know, and actually, we saw that. One of my favourite subjects to talk about is cryptocurrencies. I mean, cryptocurrency and Bitcoin only came to be because we were in the crisis. You know, it wasn't necessary. It wasn't, deemed important, or wouldn't have been deemed important 20 years earlier. But it came at a moment in history and economic history, which meant it suddenly had, you know, a much louder voice and became more prominent. And I look around, you know, finance and the speed at which technology is evolving in the, broadly the fintech space, and it's time, with inequality at its highest ever. Technology is now going to facilitate some of this change, and what we have is a generation which is, sadly, is dying out. The boomer generation. They are the wealthiest generation that has ever lived, but that wealth will ultimately have to be transferred to the millennials, and that wealth transfer is occurring, and it will occur and be accelerated by what we're seeing in, I say, sort of new fintech space and technology in general.
A lot of people may be wondering, wait a minute, there are crises all the time. So the last fourth turning happened during World War II and the Great Depression. There have been crises all the time during this period. Why now? Why do these crises matter? And I would suggest that it's the mood, as you've brought up so often here, Adam. It's the mood of the culture, of the Anglo-American culture. After the Second World War, after the Great Depression, nothing would stop these cultures. Nothing. Because they had triumphed against all odds and achieved the most miraculous victory. No crisis would guide them or knock them off the path. But 80 years later, nobody's around that remembers why the present rules were put into place, why the institutions are as they are. The confidence in institutions has been ebbing over the generations, lower and lower and lower. And now they're at a low. We hit a crisis that we would hit all the time. Events happen all the time. But when we hit the crisis, when our social mood is, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, weak, susceptible, we will react angrily or depressed. It's at these moments when we say that the system as is, the social contract, is not working for us and we need a new social contract. And you've seen that in Europe. In 2014, the European parliamentary elections, there was a surge of outsiders, of populists. And then we had Brexit. And then we had a socialist run for the candidacy of the American Democratic Party, which is very unusual in America. And then we had President Trump, candidate Trump. And that's continued. This sort of radical populists are coming to the fore because people are asking for alternatives. We're not happy with what is. And the point of the book is we knew this was coming. That's the point. And so let's talk about finance, because this is money sense. You said the boomers are the wealthiest generation, and the millennials, I think, are the poorest at this stage of their lives relative to where...
Because they grew up in, were looking for jobs in the middle of the financial crisis in 2008. So yes, they haven't benefited from rising stock prices in the way that previous generations were from rising real estate prices. They've basically been locked out.
And that's unsustainable. Mm-hmm. That's not going to continue. And so I believe what's going to happen is that people in power will perform a wealth transfer over the next decade. But, I thought the virus would have been the catalyst to get everyone on the same side. But that's definitely not happened, has it? There are people arguing about it, and we're looking for a crisis that gets everyone rowing in the same direction towards a new goal, a new vision. And it's at that point where people will agree what the future rules of the road are, the new social contract, and how the finances should be aligned.
Absolutely, and that also explains why, we are only in the early stages of the fourth turning, until we have that pivotal point where we all come together largely and conform and find some common ground. At the moment it feels like we've never been more polarized.
Mm-hmm. Which is normal. That's what happens during the fourth turning.
Mm-hmm. But this millennial generation, the hero generation, will be the generation that finds the solutions to these problems. But in terms of wealth transfer, I mean, that wealth transfer can happen a number of ways. But at the moment, the wealth has been concentrated in the hands of the boomers in real estate and stock prices. What we've actually seen is less interest in real estate and even stocks and shares from millennials, but far more interest in things like, as I say, cryptocurrencies. So that is that is where they are ahead of the next generation. So that wealth transfer, I guess, can either happen through an appreciation prices of stuff that the boomers don't own, so cryptocurrencies, or through depressed prices in stocks and shares and real estate. If we get to the point that we have a real estate crisis, millennials may once again, find that houses are affordable. And at that point, and probably that's going to be with government support, government make it easier for first-time buyers, which in the UK we're hearing the government is potentially allowing first-time buyers to unlock pension money for houses to provide lower mortgages for first-time buyers. So that's starting to happen. But it should make the asset allocation decisions of the last 10, 20 years the next 10 and 20 years should be vastly different from what we have seen.
That is the key. A lot of people, me, before reading this book, believe that time is linear, and therefore next year will be like this year and then the year after that. But it's like winter or spring or summer or fall. Vastly different phase transitions between one era and the next, much like the world before World War II is completely unrecognizable in this era that we're living now. And I maintain that as soon as this crisis is over, which, by the way, began in 2008, so just to give people an idea, and referencing again Game of Thrones, the idea of winter lasting for a generation, this began in 2008. The economy has been a poor one, even if stock prices have been up, poor relative to previous periods, and now another terrible blow. And I believe this will give impetus to government to perform more radical actions, such as perhaps financial repression, whereby they keep rates of return below inflation so as to pay off, to move money from creditors, which would be the who are they? The baby boomers, to people who are in debt, debtors, which is the millennials and the government. So their alignment is in that direction.
And the other interesting thing around that is, given we are talking about a whole new period of time, what we considered wealth in the last 20 years, which is maybe 40 years, was a monetary wealth, may well not be as important to future generations, both the millennials and what follows, and Gen Z, homeland generation. It may not be about monetary wealth accumulation. It's maybe people will give more prominence to things like a better quality of life, more time with children, more time away from the office. That wealth transfer doesn't only have to occur just in a monetary sense. And I think from that also, the middle class has been totally carved out. So as I say, inequality is at its highest. So actually what we need to see, or what we're likely to see if history repeats, is a building up once more of that middle class.
That's right. And inequality was at its at the highest at that time, was as we entered World War II. I believe it was very high. And it's rhyming of history, I suppose. And there's a saying that if you don't know your history, you are doomed to repeat it. And that's by George Santayana. I forgot his name, but he's a Spanish essayist. But a more recent American, George Friedman, said it doesn't matter if you know your history, you're doomed to repeat it anyway. But it's just good to know. And that's what we see in all these books and this literature, is that we're bound to follow this path, seemingly, of going through a crisis, building up a world, and then that world steadily decaying, and then rebirth and the Renaissance again. And can you talk for just a minute, because we're almost out of time. What comes after the crisis? Because 2020, you know how right now we say, oh, that's 2020, things go sideways. It's a decade, in my opinion. It's not just going to be this year. It's going to be the whole year, whole decade. But after the decade, some optimism, yes?
Absolutely. And as we keep saying, history repeats. So towards the end of this decade, we are going to be into the spring period, the awakening period, where, the institutions serve us well. Life is good. People are happy. We less polarized opinions. And
unified countries, unified societies.
Yeah. So it all depends on your age and your outlook. But as a father, I'm very optimistic that my children are going to have a lot of their lives living in a very good, positive environment, and a happy place. But unfortunately, we will have to go through this more difficult period now to get to that more happy place. And
that more difficult period will unify us. That's the key. Let me read, as we exit the show, from Rudyard Kipling, who wrote at 1919, and the poem is called The Gods of the Copybook Headings. Here it is, just a few lines. As it will be in the future, it was at the birth of man. There are only 4 things certain since social progress began: that the dog returns to his vomit, that the sow returns to her mire, and the burnt fool's bandaged finger goes wobbling back to the fire. And that after this is accomplished, the brave new world begins. So that's the golden age that we begin, that we're looking forward to. Ladies and gentlemen, it was a pleasure speaking to you, and we will speak to you again in a fortnight.
The Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan. We're here for you. We are a not-for-profit, member-centric plan with a democratically elected volunteer board of trustees representing all sectors of the Cayman Islands economy. We have an all-in expense ratio of less than 1%, over 20,000 members, and $490 million in assets under management. We were the first multi-employer pension plan approved by the regulator in the late 1990s, and today we are still strong, secure, and are here for our employees and employers alike. If you would like to join or require further information, visit chamberpension.ky. And for information as it happens, follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, or Instagram. Email admin@pensions.ky or call 745-7630. The Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan. We're here for you. Money Sense is brought to you by the Chamber Pension Plan. For further information, visit